scripture reading this morning will be from John chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. John 4, 7 through 10. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water."
There's a lot of situations where it's a difficult time to present a lesson and to speak, and one of those is when you're standing between people and food. And so I'm not going to talk too long, but I am going to share something with you. But I also want to take the opportunity to re-invite you to stay for potluck today. It's a real opportunity to kind of get to know each other, and then afterwards to spend a little more time together and worship. It makes all the difference in the world. It's always I get to know people a little bit better, just some of those simple situations. So you're definitely invited to stick around. I looked this up. In most cases, if you don't eat food, we're going to make it to potluck. But if you don't eat food, you can last about 3 weeks, and that depends on various factors, give or take. We're actually going to talk about water. A person can last about 3 days, and again, depending on various factors. I always think it's interesting to kind of consider what God could have done, how he could have designed us. He could have done anything he wanted. He could have made it to where, you get a good drink of water once a week and you're good for the week, or maybe constant. It could have been like that, But he set it up to where about every 3 days you'd be in big trouble. And of course, throughout the day, hopefully we're drinking water. We know in Colorado that's a big deal to not get dehydrated. We need certain things to survive, but one of the top items on the list is water. That's how he designed us. He said, okay, you're going to need air and food and things like that. Something you need pretty consistently is water. I had a friend point out to me, it sounds kind of simple, but it kind of always stuck in my mind. Interesting about water, it's colorless, it's tasteless. I mean, it really doesn't have much to it. There can be a certain taste to it depending on what county you're in or something like that. But in general, it doesn't have a taste, doesn't have a color, no frills. For something that we absolutely need, it doesn't have much going for it except that it keeps you alive. There's no aesthetic appeal to it until we start decorating it and putting it in beverages and things like that. But we flat out need it to survive all the time. Seems like, as far as efficiency, it seems like it would have been better to design us not to need it, or at least not need it as much, or maybe less often, but we need it constantly. When God sent his son, this might be worth pointing out too, to finalize the plan of salvation, it took place in a part of the world where there wasn't a lot of water. Either bad planning or maybe something is going on that's worth taking note of. In some cases where a lot of what we read about in the Bible, the sources of water are pretty scarce. And as you probably know, if you're familiar with the Bible, as a result, a lot of important things happened at various water sources. One of the most famous conversations recorded in the Bible is at a well. Look at John 4 again, verse 7. Look at this again that James read for us. John 4, verse 7. It's significant. They're getting a drink of water. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away to the city to buy food. Therefore, the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And so when you read about wells in the Bible, they're not necessarily, I found out they're not a lot like the wells that you might be familiar with today. I know it's nice when we're in a location and say, "Oh yeah, we're on a well." You've probably heard that said before. I guess back then what they'd usually do is just dig a deep hole into the rock, and then the surface, the sides of the well, would just kind of leak water from the rock, from the sides of the shaft, and then it would fill up the bottom. A far cry from what we can simply do, just go in and turn on a faucet. But it would just kind of leak out of the side of the shaft of this well and fill up the bottom of the well. Sometimes a stone was placed over the top. When you picture, I don't know if you picture a well when you're reading about Jesus and this woman, it's not the little wishing well with the little roof on top of it and a bucket or something like that. It was probably a big old hole with a rim, and then there was a covering typically to keep animals from falling inside, because that kind of, you can get a taste for water then. But they keep the animals out, and of course for people not to fall in. And it's pretty heavy, so there's limited access. It was very unlikely a single person could go over and say, I'm going to go get a drink of water, and just move it by themselves, unless they were pretty strong. In fact, it was kind of a romantic gesture, I guess, on Jacob's part when he first met Rachel in Genesis 29. I don't know if you ever caught this. She was there with her sisters, and he uncovered the well for him. So it's kind of like, here you go, let me get that for you. And that's how they met. Kind of like opening a jar of olives, I guess, but a little more manly. Wells were one solution for your water supply back then. There was another option, another solution. It was called a cistern. This doesn't, you might think that's the opposite of brethren, but it's a cistern, and it's similar to a well, and it was not a natural source of water. It wasn't a matter of just digging in to the rock and then having the water kind of fill it up. All it basically was a large hole in the ground, and it was a storage tank. It was dug for storing water. They were subterranean reservoirs, sometimes as big as an acre, pretty big. And the rock didn't, trickle water or leak water into it. You had to go haul the water from another place and then keep filling it. During the spring, it was pretty clever. They would collect rainwater. They'd get a series of troughs and kind of channel the water into the cistern, and you'd have that in there. So not as good as a well, but better than nothing. And there were a lot of cisterns, I guess. It was very common back then. In fact, so many cisterns were in Jerusalem that during the siege they had plenty of water. They had planned ahead. And you probably know a siege, they'd surround the outside and not let any water or food get into them. But they had plenty of water because of these cisterns. But it took a lot of work. If you can imagine that was your project for the week. So you're going to make a cistern, it would be a big, big deal because it was cut into rock. And then you'd have to line the interior with cement or mason work, kind of, build some stones in there. And that was to keep the water from leaking out. This is why it was a big deal. If you want to take a glance at Deuteronomy 6, it's mentioned briefly here, and I'll tell you why it's mentioned. Deuteronomy 6, verse 10. Remember, God's telling him about the promised land that they're going to go in and take. And he tells them, says, you know what, this is going to be a pretty nice deal for you, because there's going to be stuff that's already built. You're going to just stroll right in and take over. And notice what's listed here in Deuteronomy 6, verse 10. Then it shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I can picture them hearing this, saying, and it's got this, and it's this, and a bunch of cisterns. You can almost hear this collective sigh among the men saying, oh, that's great. It's kind of like checking out a new house. It says, yes, it's got a walk-in fridge. Says, oh, good. That sounds good to me. It's got cisterns. This is nice. A lot less work is going to be needed. So cisterns were much more common back then than wells. Now, the downside of a cistern is it's not that fresh, not fresh water, really. Like I say, the well, it's got the water coming down the sides and filling up the hole in the bottom. Cistern is transported there. And a lot of times, this water had a taste. It tasted like the soil around it. Even though they would do that mason work, maybe use some cement, it'd have this kind of off taste about it. Say, oh, this is cistern water. You could kind of tell. And it wasn't unusual to get a drink of water and find worms in it. It was just, that's how it was with cistern water. As far as drinking water, it was not the best choice. There's something worse than a cistern, and that's almost like a riddle. What could be worse than a cistern? A broken cistern. Jeremiah talks about this in Jeremiah 2. I'll give you the verse here in a second. To give you a little bit of background, he was sent to deliver a message to some people in a hopeless situation. Their backs are against the wall. They're out of options because Babylon's coming. You remember they were the second group to come and take the last half of the promised land, and disasters in the air. And Jeremiah's job is to kind of get their attention. Their one and only hope is to trust God, to obey God completely. But the people didn't like God's plan, and they decided to do things their way. They chose to try and make it on their own. And to show how foolish this is, that they're going to reject God and just do it their own way, God uses Jeremiah to compare two kinds of water sources. So here's Jeremiah 2:13. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, to hew for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So I'm offering them living water. They want to do their own thing. They're going to make their own cistern, and to make matters worse, it's broken. It's a situation where you go, you're thirsty, and you don't even have water with worms. You just have the worms. There's nothing there. It's empty. He's saying that's what your life is going to be like, as an empty cistern. That's kind of ironic, because I guess you'll notice this in the Bible, if you keep your eyes peeled, a broken cistern actually had a use. It was good for one thing in particular, a prison. It was a good place to stash somebody if you didn't want them to go anywhere. It's kind of narrow at the top. There's the opening. And then since you want a lot of storage area, it was like a giant bottle. And so you'd put somebody down in there, and it was a very efficient prison. They couldn't get out. When Joseph's brothers betrayed him, that's what they used. I just kind of pictured, I don't know, a big hole where he's kind of looking up at them and say, hey, you guys don't do this. And he's just down in this hole. But here, look at Genesis 37:23. It's going to use the word pit, but you'll notice there's a storage idea used for it. So it came about when Joseph, this is Genesis 37:23. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. So it was a water storage place, and they put him in it. It's sadly appropriate that Jeremiah, go back to Jeremiah 38. Here's Jeremiah 38. Remember, he's the one that said, your life is like a broken cistern. And ironically enough, they put him in one. Jeremiah 38:6. So after they don't like what he's telling them, they reject his message, they get fed up, and here's what they do. Jeremiah 38:6, and they took Jeremiah and cast him into the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the court of the guardhouse, and they let Jeremiah down with ropes. Now in the cistern there was no water but only mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud. As far as Joseph, it seems that it was dry a long time ago. This was recently dry, maybe because of the enemy coming and they were out of water. But Jeremiah is lowered into a cistern and sinks in the mud. Later he's rescued from this cistern, but the people aren't. They are not rescued. They rejected the water God offered, and they chose a broken cistern, and that was the end of them. They chose, in a sense, a prison for themselves. This is true of anyone who rejects God's way of doing things. It's kind of important for us to take this away. We have running water, so we're probably not going to bump into any of these water sources that I'm talking about this morning. It's true for anyone who rejects God's way of doing things. When we want to do things our way, it might seem like a good plan, but eventually you run out of water. That's what happens. So this is working. My way is working. Look, one bucket full after another. It's going great. So he's saying it's just a matter of time. Emptiness is inevitable. This is how people become hollow people. Dry and empty as broken cisterns. He's saying that's your life. When people turn their back on the water offered by God, they end up with nothing. And it's a good reminder to all of us. Pursuing the world is a matter of pursuing emptiness. If you go to Jeremiah 2 again, you know what's really frightening about this is that it's not that you just end up with emptiness, you become emptiness. It doesn't just make your goals empty, it makes you empty. Here's Jeremiah 2:5. It's easy to miss. Notice how he puts this. What injustice did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me and walked after emptiness and became empty? If we go after emptiness, we will become empty. So I tell you these two things about wells and cisterns to tell you about the best source. It's better than a cistern, and it's better than a well, and it's what Jesus was talking about that day with the Samaritan woman. Go back to John 4. So they're sitting at a well. This is probably the kind where they dig a hole straight down and let the rock kind of trickle its water in and it collects. He's saying, I'm going to tell you about something better than that. And it might not be what you think. And he's telling her there's something better than a well. And we're not talking about broken cisterns or wells. John 4, verse 10, picking up where we left off before. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. She said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well, and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Now it's easy I've often read this and think living water, and I pictured the Samaritan woman kind of leaning back and say, some mystical living water, I see. That's not what's going on. You notice she's not like, what are you talking about living? She knows what he's talking about. She's still not getting the spiritual level. It's not just a religious metaphor. But to get to the spiritual meaning of this, we have to make sure we don't miss the earthly meaning. In our daily Bible reading, we've been reading the congregation together, and we've read Leviticus together. That was part of what we read. And you might remember there was a ceremony. It's in Leviticus 14. This is the first time I noticed that. I always thought of living water as kind of a mystical, kind of religious metaphor. There's a little more to it that leads to the religious metaphor. So I'm going to look at Leviticus 14. And starting with verse 5, it's a ceremony for cleansing a leper. You probably remember reading through a lot of the detailed situations that would help the people if they obeyed God. And here's what you would do, part of what you would do, when you're trying to put leprosy behind for a person. Leprosy is recorded in Leviticus 14, verse 5. The priest shall also give orders to slay the one bird in an earthenware vessel over running water. As for the live bird, he shall take it together with the cedar wood and the scarlet string and the hyssop, and shall dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was slain over the running water. And you might have a footnote for running water. And you'll notice, if you do, that it's living water. That's what initially living water is running water. It would have not, I don't think, been unheard of for people to be hiking somewhere and say, oh, look, living water, and not be like, oh, a religious conversation. No, it's running water. It's alive. It's not asleep. I guess like you might describe a well or a cistern, or dead, stagnant. It's alive. It's living water. It's moving. And that's the best source of water, not a cistern or a well. The best choice you could get back then was a fresh spring, water that comes up out of the earth. In other words, from a source. See, a well and a cistern didn't have that. Not back in the terms that they would use. You also, in your daily Bible reading, you might notice a lot of names. You know, you kind of go through those list of names, and that's when you really have to challenge yourself. And we kind of play a game of saying, well, maybe we'll name our next kid after this, and kind of, maybe not. So you go down the list of these places, and there's sometimes lists of names. And you'll notice some cities start with EN, like Endor and Engadi and things like that. The EN means spring. So as you're reading your Bible and you come across a place, and if it starts with EN, it's kind of like Colorado Springs. There was a spring there. There's a source of water there. There's a big difference between a well and a spring. The difference in one case, look at Genesis 26. This actually led to a fight. They were digging. It was all about water, and then they came across some living water, and they were ready to fight over it. Genesis 26:18. Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, the water is ours. They wanted that really good source of water. Everyone knew, including the Samaritan woman, one of the best things you could find was running water or living water. That's what Jesus was saying that day. He says, you have a water source, that's great. Says, but it's limited. Eventually it dries up like a cistern or a well, but I've got something better. Now, of course, he's going to the spiritual level. He says, I'm going to give you running water. That's what he said to her. He says, where's this running water? He says, no, this running water, it can be with you all the time. See, that's pretty key here. A lot of people treat Christianity, will go to the source, to, church building, and maybe once in a while crack the Bible and say, and we'll get a drink. He says, no, that's not what this is going to be. This is going to be with you all the time. Wouldn't you like to live a life where you're not spiritually thirsty all the time? How about that life? And that's what he's offering to her. He says, everything else is limited. It's going to dry up. I can offer you a well with endless fresh water, but in this case, it'll be for your soul. And if you live long enough, you know what it's like to be thirsty spiritually. And Jesus is the one who's offering this option of a fresh water source. A lot of people, unfortunately, I think, and maybe all of us have gone through this, where our religion is kind of like a cistern at best, maybe a broken cistern, or a well. It's doing okay, but it's limited. Depends on the day. He said, I got something better for you. That's what he's telling this woman. In 1 Corinthians 10:4, I'll just briefly mention this. Jesus compares himself to a rock. It talks about that Christ is the rock. And it's easy to think, that means he's stable, that he's strong. Christ is the rock. And he is. He's stable, he's strong. But that's not the context of why he's being mentioned here as a rock. Because in the wilderness, the only source of water was a rock. He's saying, I'm your source of water. And you probably remember that Moses provided water when God provided, the power to do that. Moses said, okay, time for some water. Let's build a cistern. Everybody start digging a well. That's not what was going on. He struck the rock and it bloomed a river. Plenty of fresh water. Without Jesus in this wilderness, souls die of thirst. It's so easy to hear this and then go right back out there and still rely on our cisterns instead of trusting in God and making choices in submission to Him. We frantically dig and store water on our terms, a lot like the people that Jeremiah was talking to. Jesus presents the same choices to us as He did the day with the Samaritan woman. You have two choices. You can rely on a temporary source of water or an endless one. He says, I got that option for you. There's this thirst that every soul has experienced one time or another. It's the sensation that life is empty and that it's only going to get emptier. We have felt that. We know that that is a possibility in this life. Relying on yourself and pursuing your plans is like digging a cistern or a well. It'll only last for a while. Eventually, you will get to the last few drops. There's a better way. The only water that can stop you from being thirsty on the deepest level possible. And this is what Jesus offers. It's a full life, a life without the desperation of trying to dig for your own happiness. If that's something you're interested in, this is what Jesus offered to the woman at the well, and this is what He also offers anyone willing to come to Him. Hope you'll think about it while we stand together and sing.